Hey everybody! In today's video, I'm going to be doing some no-line coloring with these gorgeous Morning Glories, my absolute favorite flower. And I'm using this waterproof hybrid ink to stamp my image with. The reason that I point out that it is hybrid is because I'm using it with watercolor, but you can also use it with alcohol markers. So your no-line coloring can be anything you want it to be. You can have the precision of alcohol markers, or you can have the slightly looser look that I'm going to show you today with some Daniel Smith watercolor. Now, when I do florals or botanicals, I like to do wet on wet for the larger areas. You're going to see me do both wet on wet and wet on dry throughout this little exercise. And I'm beginning with clear water and then dropping in some manganese blue hue. And on top of that, phthalo blue green shade for the very vivid blue that my very favorite Morning Glory has, which is the Heavenly Blue Morning Glory. Now, these are climbers. And so there are little tendrils that you'll see me painting later. This is a very realistic stamp, and I am someone who knows Morning Glories very well, having grown them for many years. Now, I have put the water everywhere, but in the very center of the flower, that's going to be yellow. So I've left that dry. That's kind of a little barrier. This purple and the blue will mix together and blend, but that little area in the center will stay dry, and I will drop some yellow into there shortly. So I'm putting the purple into the center of the flower where it would naturally be a little bit darker, kind of where those leaves sort of curve down to where there's a little cup at the bottom of the flower, and that's where the flower center is. And then I'll come back and drop that yellow in and let that blend out. So I dropped it into the dry, but I let it blend out into the purple. And that gives that kind of glowy look that Morning Glories have. And here you can see how the hybrid ink actually stays visible underneath that watercolor. It's one of the reasons it makes a great no-line watercolor. Is I'm still able to see all of those lines all around the image and use them as guides while I am painting. If you're using a dye-based ink versus a hybrid ink, those lines will dissolve as you're painting. And for me personally, I don't have great vision to begin with. And so having those lines disappear, it makes it more difficult for me to follow the lines of the image. And so I really do recommend this hybrid ink. It really makes a big difference. Now, this is kind of a smaller image, which is really nice. It has 3 flowers and 1 little bud. And so it's fairly easy to paint and fairly quick to paint, even though some of what I'm doing is kind of detailed and there's a little bit of a process to it. But these being smaller images, if you wanted to just jump off into no-line watercolor, this is a great image because it really comes together pretty quickly. I have sped this video up 2 times, and so in the time that you're going to watch this video, which is about 14 minutes, in real time, this would have taken about 28 minutes, but of course I stopped and grabbed supplies and did some other things, but just to show you how quickly this can come together when you're working with an image the right size. If you're just starting no-line watercolor, I really recommend a smaller image. It'll help you practice and get some of the concepts down that I'm going to talk about. Now, on this 3rd flower, I'm doing the same thing. This one's a little bit farther away. I'm actually going to make this one a little bit darker. And I'm popping the yellow back into the center But that one got a little bit too dark, so I'm actually just lifting it with a dry brush, kind of drying that brush off on my hand. So this is the basis of the 3 flowers. One of the things that you need to remember when you're doing no-line coloring is that it's not going to be beautiful in all of its phases. So keep going, because when I add the details, the wet on dry details at the very end, you're just going to be amazed at how big a difference that makes. What you're trying to do in the first phase of no-line watercolor is get nice blended color down onto the image. The end is where we come in and kind of sharpen the focus a little bit, but this is for nice, soft, blended color all over the base of these images. Now I'm going to do the leaves. And I'm actually going to mix 2 different kinds as well as 2 different colors of watercolor. The first one is a granulating green, which is Green Apatite Genuine. And when you use a granulating color, you will get this texture that kind of settles down into the texture of the watercolor paper, which adds so much to botanicals. I love doing this on leaves. Green Apatite is probably my most used foliage base color. But then I'm also adding a non-granulating lighter, more yellow-green on top of that to show light in and around the leaves, like sort of where light is hitting them. And so there's both a difference in texture and color. And I will come back and add shadows to these at the very end. So I'll do the same thing on all of these leaves, mix that granulating color with the non-granulating, and I'll show you a close-up in just a second of exactly what that granulation does once you get it down on your watercolor paper. Now, if you need to, just take the acetate with the stamp image on it and sort of line it up over your image from time to time if you feel like you're losing some of the details as you paint and you need to figure out what is what. So like here I have, it's kind of a folded leaf, and it wasn't super obvious when I first looked at it what that was supposed to look like. So just refer to the artwork on your stamp packaging if you get a little bit confused part of the way through, like I often do when I am no line coloring, especially on kind of larger, more abstract shapes like these leaves. So same thing here, starting with the dark. This is also kind of a larger leaf, so it's a little bit easier to paint, and I'm filling it with water and then dropping in that color and letting it blend. Now here's where you can really see the difference between a granulating color and a non-granulating. See that texture in the darker areas? It's amazing. Now I wanted to take a look at some actual photos of Morning Glories to kind of see how to approach adding the detail to the flower centers. And I can see how there's like a dark ring in the center and then a bright yellow, little more dimensional piece in the center of the flower. I have no idea what all the technical terms for that are, even though I'm a gardener. I don't pay attention to that stuff. So first I will use one of my teeny tiny brushes and I'm going to add some dark lines, because in those photos that I was looking at, you could see some darker lines as well as some little triangular cuts in from the edges of the petals. That's actually something I like to do on all my florals. I love to draw these little triangles. It's almost like a little tear in the petal, and it really adds a lot. Now, you don't want to do it super consistently. That can lead to kind of a cartoonish look for your flower. So don't draw in all of every single vein. Do a little bit here, skip, a little bit there, skip, and that's going to make your flowers look a lot more natural. But already you can see that just the addition of the darker veins in these flowers makes it just pop out and look so much more realistic right from the start of adding details. And that's why I'm saying hang in there with your no line. You might get done painting it and then think, ugh, this looks terrible. But it's the detail work at the end after everything's dry that makes such a big difference in the way the outcome is when you are done painting. So keep going and get yourself a super fine brush. Now I have one leaf. I don't know why I forgot this one leaf. So I'm going to go back in and fill in this one. There are actually 2 leaves. There's a 3rd leaf in between these 2 larger leaves, and I don't know why I ignored them. Maybe just because that other leaf was wet. You want to alternate wet and dry areas so that they don't bleed into each other. So instead of painting that 3rd leaf, I will go work on the centers. Now I used a neutral here. I used Shadow Violet. You can use any kind of gray-ish color. You could also use the darker purples and blues, but I'm basically just drawing kind of a little donut around that center to make that look dimensional. It doesn't have to be super precise. I am blending a little bit though, because in those photos I looked at, it wasn't like a very sharp outline. It was more like a fuzzy kind of shadow. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm going back with just a wet brush and softening down that gray line. But already that looks so much more realistic. I just think it looks great. So now we'll go back and do this 3rd leaf now that everything's dry. And this one I'm just going to make lighter because it sort of looks like it's sitting on top of that lower leaf. And so it would naturally be catching the sunlight. Now I'm putting down just clean water, about 1/4 of an inch width underneath the flower, and then I'm dropping in dark purple as a shadow. This is the part that really makes your paintings pop. So clean water, a little bit wider than what your shadow is going to be, and then drop in your dark shadow color and let it just bleed out into that water. And it'll give you this nice soft blend, beautiful soft shadow, and it's going to make that flower pop out and look so dimensional. Same here, except on this one, the leaf is actually on top of the flower, so the shadow is going to go onto the Morning Glory itself. And I'm just using the same violet color that I used elsewhere in the flowers. If you use shadow colors that are drawn from what you've already painted, the whole thing is going to have harmony. It's going to look great rather than just setting off in a new direction with a brand new shadow color. Just pull from the colors you already have and apply them with a higher pigment to water ratio, and that's just going to look amazing. So I will finish up this shadow here. Again, make the water that you put down about twice as wide as what you want your shadow to be, because that gives you enough room to let that self blend and be soft and not a super hard edge. Now is the time where I'll go touch up different little areas of the painting, leaves, things that I forgot. Don't think I have ever done a watercolor or no line watercolor where I didn't get to this point and say, oh my gosh, I forgot an entire leaf, or I forgot a bud, or whatever. It happens. It happens. But the no line ink lets you have a little bit of creative freedom. Things don't have to be exactly the shape they were on the stamp. And so sometimes that can help you decomplicate certain areas. Like if a stem was overly complicated and you didn't want to paint it, you could just kind of fudge that a little bit because that ink is so light. And as everything dries, it's going to get even lighter. Now on the leaves, I am adding little bits of veining. Again, not drawing them all the way across the leaf. You can see a little gap there. That's what makes it look a lot more natural, is if you don't create full lines for anything. If you just have little partial lines, little dark spots, it's going to look a lot more realistic. Now I am going to darken up this little bud up here. It's a little bit washed out, and so I needed it to more closely match the flowers. So I just added a little bit of pigment to that, but isn't that gorgeous close up? I love it so much. So here is the finished image, and this is what it looks like when it's made into a card. I hope you've enjoyed this little watercolor lesson. Head over to my blog for more information, and thanks so much for watching.